Hi everyone. So today we're going to go over a rebellion by a slave by the name of Nat Turner. This particular rebellion happens in 1831, which is 30 years before the starting of the Civil War. The Civil War is from 1861 until 1865. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is today's quote. Now, it says, "Scars upon a slave's back were considered evidence of a rebellious or unruly spirit, and hurt his sail." This particular quote comes to us from Solomon Northrop in 1841. You'll notice the picture to the left of the quote, which shows the scars on a Black American's back. Now, these scars are the results of whipping, because the slave owner felt that this particular slave was being defiant. So for today's Do Now, you have to interpret what you think this quote means about a rebellious slave. And again, I'll read the quote one more time before you pause this video. "Scars upon a slave's back were considered evidence of a rebellious or unruly spirit, and hurt his sail." So take a moment now, pause this video and respond to that Do Now question. So today we're going to talk about Nat Turner and his rebellion. This happens on an August evening in 1831. But before we do, I do want to make one distinction between slaves in cities versus slaves that were living on plantations. Let's take a look at some urban slaves before we talk about the rebellion. By 1831, there is an increase of cotton wealth that lures more whites to have plantations. And so they leave their jobs as skilled workers, such as carpenters or blacksmiths, to go and own a plantation. Once that happens, there are some black slaves that were, again, in cities that were then used to fill in those jobs. So the result of this is twofold. One, we have a shortage of white workers in these fields. And two, slaves are now being used in lieu of those whites who went to go open and run their farms. Let's talk about Nat Turner. Now, Nat Turner was born into slavery in the year 1800 in Virginia. He was a preacher, and he had believed that he had been chosen to lead his people out of bondage, that this was his divine right. Well, one particular night in August of that year, there was an eclipse of the moon. And when he saw that, he took it as his signal to take action. So he takes 60 different slaves that follow him, and, I said 60, I meant 80. 80 slaves follow him. And they begin rummaging through the town, and they kill about 60 different whites before they're finally captured. Now, not all of them was captured. As a matter of fact, Nat Turner was able to escape and hide for several weeks before he was eventually captured. Once he was captured, he was tried for his crimes, and he was hanged as his punishment. Now, in some cases, there were people that were captured. As a matter of fact, there were 200 slaves that were captured in retaliation, and many of them had nothing to do with that evening at all, and yet they were still punished for what happened. The ultimate result of this particular incident is that the South realized how dangerous slave results can be and made it more difficult for slaves by passing more restrictions on what they can do, when they do it, how, and more. By the way, if you hear that noise in the background, that'd be my dog playing with her chew toy. So let's talk about the debate that this sparks in Virginia. Initially, Virginia was considering abolishing slavery. But after this revolt, the motion didn't pass. This ends the debate on slavery in the South in the time period known as antebellum. Antebellum is a fancy word that just basically means before the Civil War, at least for us here in America. But in antebellum in general, if we're talking about other countries in the world, just signifies a time period leading up to a major war event. For the United States, that's the Civil War. Now, there are backlashes from these revolts, and those include creating slave codes to put tighter limits on slaves, and free African Americans in the South also lose some of their rights. But that's not the end of the story for them. Next we have, and we discussed the other day, you read the reading by George Fitzhugh, in which he discusses his justification for slavery. Well, here's a little bit more to add on to that particular reading. Some pro-slavery defenses. Excuse me. Now, some slavery advocates felt that there were stories in the Bible that justified the idea of the superiority of one race over another. Then, in the South, many congressmen enacted what's known as a gag rule. Now, the gag rule was not in place for very long. As a matter of fact, it was repealed or voided or taken away in 1844. This does two things. Number one, it puts a limit on debating the issue of slavery. In other words, you're not allowed to discuss abolition in the South. And number two, it deprives the citizens the right to be heard, which takes away two different aspects of your First Amendment right, because you cannot have your freedom of speech and you cannot have your freedom to protest. This is the end of the lesson on Nat Turner. Now that we're done, you can go to the Nat Turner assignment on Schoology and complete it there. It's a brief reading and a couple of questions, but it's definitely worthwhile. Have a great day.